I used to think the worst thing a man could lose was his job or his health. I was wrong. The worst thing you can lose is the version of yourself that trusted easily. And I lost mine standing in a laundry room, holding a piece of paper.
I used to think the worst thing a man could lose was his job, his health, maybe his father, if he was lucky enough to have one long enough to lose. I was wrong. The worst thing you can lose is the version of yourself that trusted easily, because once that's gone, it doesn't come back the same way. I know the exact night mine disappeared. Not because of shouting, not because of a slammed door, because of a receipt. A small, folded piece of paper in a coat pocket that wasn't mine, for a dinner I never had, at a restaurant I'd never heard of, dated a Tuesday. I remembered clearly because I'd worked a double and come home to a plate left in the microwave and a story about a headache and an early night. I stood in that laundry room for 11 minutes. I counted them later, working backward from the timestamp on my phone. 11 minutes deciding whether to become a man who asks questions or a man who keeps living the life he already had. I chose to ask. That decision is the reason you're hearing this story at all. 22 years earlier, none of this seemed possible. I was 26, working construction during the day and taking night classes toward a supervisor's license when I met her at a friend's cookout. She laughed at something I said that wasn't even that funny, and I remember thinking, this is the kind of woman who makes you better just by paying attention to you. She had a way of asking questions that made you feel like the only person in the room, and back then I mistook that for something rare, something that meant she saw me clearly. We got married 18 months later in her parents' backyard, folding chairs and string lights, her father crying more than either of us did. I built us a life the way I'd been taught to build anything worth keeping. Slowly, on a solid foundation, a house we could actually afford, a savings account we didn't touch, 2 kids we raised to say please and thank you, and to shake a man's hand like they meant it. From the outside, and honestly from the inside too, it looked like the kind of marriage men my age were supposed to want. The kind you point to at a barbecue and say, that's how it's done. We had our routines. Sunday mornings at the same diner, coffee first, then the paper split between us the way we'd done it since our 20s. Friday nights when the kids got older, just the 2 of us at the kitchen table, a couple of beers, talking about nothing in particular. I used to tell my brother that the secret to a long marriage wasn't some big romantic gesture. It was just showing up for the small, boring moments, over and over, for 20 years straight. I believed that completely. I still believe it, actually. I just didn't understand, yet that showing up isn't the same thing as being told the truth. I think back now to the year our youngest left for college, because that's when things really started to shift, though I didn't see it as a shift at the time. The house got quiet in a way it hadn't been in over 2 decades, and instead of that quiet drawing us closer, it seemed to open up space for things to drift in that never would have found room before. She started a part-time job at a boutique downtown, something to fill the hours, she said, and I encouraged it, genuinely, because I wanted her to have something that was hers. That job is where she met Russ's wife first, and through her, Russ himself, at a holiday event I didn't attend because I was working a late shift that week. I remember her coming home that night talking about how funny he was, how he'd made the whole room laugh with some story about a failed business venture years earlier, and I remember laughing along with her secondhand, thinking nothing of it at all. There were small things, looking back. There always are. A phone that started facing screen down on the counter instead of screen up. A girls' weekend that got extended by a day with an apology that felt slightly too smooth, too rehearsed, like a line she'd practiced in the car. A friend of hers, a man named Russ, who I met exactly twice and who both times looked at me a beat too long before shaking my hand, like he was measuring something. He had the kind of handshake that tries too hard, the kind that makes you want to check your wallet after. None of it registered as anything at the time. You don't build a case against your own wife in real time. You build a life. I was building ours right up until the week before everything changed, when we celebrated our anniversary at the same restaurant we'd gone to every year since the kids were small, And she cried a little during dinner and said she didn't know what she'd done to deserve a man like me. I believed her completely. That's the part that still gets me. Not that she said it, that I believed it, and that I went home that night and told myself I was the luckiest man at that table. The decision that started the unraveling wasn't dramatic. That's what nobody tells you about the moment your life changes. It's rarely the loud moment. It's the quiet one you don't notice you're making. 3 weeks after our anniversary, she came to me about Russ. Not romantically, she said, just as a friend. He was starting a small logistics company and needed a short-term investor, someone reliable, someone he trusted because his wife trusted him. She asked if we could put in $18,000 from savings, just for 4 months. Guaranteed return, she said. He'd already shown her the numbers, and he'd even offered to show them to me too if I wanted, which somehow made it feel more legitimate than if he'd avoided the question entirely. I had a bad feeling. Not proof, just a feeling, the kind you get in your chest before your brain catches up with it. I remember sitting across from her at that same kitchen table, watching her explain the numbers with a confidence that wasn't quite hers, like she was reciting something someone else had rehearsed with her. And I had a choice in that moment that I didn't recognize as a choice at all. I could ask to see the numbers myself, meet this man properly, take a week to think it over the way I'd take a week to think over anything that size. Or I could trust my wife, because that's what 22 years is supposed to buy you. I remember thinking that a man who needed proof from his own wife after 2 decades together wasn't really trusting her at all, and that thought alone was enough to push me past the hesitation. I wrote the check 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, and I remember feeling almost proud of myself for not making it a bigger deal than it needed to be. The 4 months came and went with vague updates. She'd mention Russ in passing, say the company was doing well, say he was grateful, say things were on track. Then 5 months. Then Russ stopped returning calls, and she stopped bringing him up unless I asked, and when I asked, her answers got shorter and her eyes moved somewhere over my shoulder, like she was reading the explanation off the wall behind me instead of out of her own memory. I told myself it was embarrassment on her part, that she felt responsible for vouching for a man who turned out to be unreliable with money. I told myself a lot of things that month. It's remarkable what a man will tell himself to avoid a conversation he's afraid of having. I even remember defending Russ once, to my own brother, saying business ventures take time, saying we shouldn't judge a man too fast. I look back on that conversation now, and I don't know whether to laugh or put my head in my hands. Then came the coat pocket and the receipt, and 11 minutes in a laundry room deciding what kind of man I was going to be for the rest of this. I didn't confront her that night. I did something else instead, something that changed the entire shape of what came next. I called my brother-in-law, her own brother, a quiet man named Tom who worked in commercial insurance and had access to things I didn't know how to access myself. Bank verification tools, business registry searches, the kind of resources that turn a bad feeling into an actual paper trail. If you've ever had a feeling in your gut you were too afraid to follow all the way through, you already know exactly where this story is headed, and I'd be lying if I said some part of me didn't already know it too, standing in that laundry room with the receipt in my hand. Tom didn't want to get involved at first, and I don't blame him. Nobody wants to be the man who hands his sister's husband the rope. But he loved his nephew and niece, and he'd noticed things too. Small things he'd talked himself out of the same way I had. It took him 4 days to come back to me with what he'd found, and when he did, he asked to meet in person instead of calling. That should have told me everything before he said a word. We sat in his truck in a parking lot outside his office, engine running for the heat, and he slid a folder across the seat like he was handing me something that might explode. Russ's logistics company didn't exist past a registration filing and a website that had never been updated since it launched. My $18,000 had gone into an account that transferred out within 9 days, split between 3 destinations, one of which was a joint account held by Russ and a woman who was not his wife. My wife's name appeared on that account too, not as an owner, as a secondary signer, added 6 weeks before she ever asked me for the money. I want to tell you I confronted her that same night with the composure of a man in complete control, but that isn't true, and this story only matters if I tell it straight. I sat in my truck outside our house for 40 minutes before I went inside, because I knew that the second I walked through that door, I would either become a man who confronts what's in front of him, or a man who spends the rest of his life pretending he never saw the papers on the passenger seat. I watched the porch light through the windshield, the same light I'd installed myself years earlier, and I thought about every version of the next 10 minutes I could choose. I went inside. I put the documents on the kitchen table without a word, and I watched 22 years of a story rearrange itself on her face in real time. Her hand went to her mouth before she even looked down at the pages fully, which told me she already knew exactly what was in that folder before she read a single line of it. She didn't deny it right away. That silence told me more than any confession could have. Then came the explanation, the one that always comes, the one where the betrayal gets repackaged as a mistake that got out of hand, a favor that turned into something she didn't know how to stop. The money, it turned out, wasn't really an investment at all. It was a bridge loan for Russ to cover a debt that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with a woman he'd been seeing for over a year, a woman my wife had known about the entire time, a woman she'd covered for on more than one of those girls' weekends that ran an extra day. My wife hadn't been sleeping with Russ. That was almost worse, in a strange way, because it meant she had traded our marriage, our savings, and my trust, not for romance, but for loyalty to someone else's secret. She'd been so committed to protecting another woman's affair that she'd been willing to sacrifice her own family to do it. When I asked her why, she said something I will never forget as long as I live. She said she didn't think it would ever touch us, as if betrayal only counts when it's discovered. I asked her that night if she'd ever considered what would happen to us if it came out the way it did. She said she had, more than once, and that every time she'd talked herself out of telling me because she didn't know how to explain it without sounding exactly like what she was. I asked her if Russ's wife knew that my wife had helped hide the affair for over a year, and she went quiet again, longer this time, before admitting that Russ's wife had started to suspect something herself in recent months, which was part of why Russ needed the money so urgently, to keep her placated with a trip she'd been asking for. A trip that never actually happened because the money had already gone elsewhere by then. Sitting there at that table, I realized I wasn't just the last person in my own house to know the truth. I was the last person in an entire circle of people who'd been managing a version of reality that had nothing to do with me. The weeks that followed were the kind you don't wish on anyone. I moved into my brother's spare room with a suitcase and a folder of documents I'd started keeping like evidence, because somewhere in me, I already knew I'd need it. I slept on a fold-out couch that first week, staring at a ceiling fan I didn't recognize, replaying 22 years like I was looking for the exact frame where it had all gone wrong. My son, 17 at the time, stopped speaking to his mother for 11 days, not out of anger at the affair angle he assumed had happened, but because she'd lied to his face when he'd asked directly if anything was wrong. He came to my brother's place one night, sat on that same fold-out couch, and asked me straight out if I still loved her. I didn't have a clean answer for him, and I think that honesty was the only thing that kept him talking to me at all in those first few weeks. My daughter, older, married herself, told me on the phone that she'd suspected something for over a year and hadn't said anything because she didn't want to be the one who broke us apart. She cried harder on that call than I did, apologizing for staying quiet, and I remember telling her that silence wasn't the thing that broke us. I'd done plenty of that on my own. Everyone, it turned out, had been protecting a version of our family that had already stopped existing. I was the last one holding on to it. If you've ever been the last person in a room to find out the truth everyone else already knew, you understand exactly how that feels, and I'd genuinely like to know how you got through it, because some days I'm still working on it myself. The financial unraveling came next, and it came fast. $18,000 doesn't sound like the kind of number that ends a marriage, but it wasn't really about the money. It was about what the money represented, that she'd made a decision that size without me, using an account I thought we managed together to protect a secret that had nothing to do with our own family. Tom, to his credit, helped me track enough of the paper trail to recover 9,000 of it through a small claims filing against Russ directly, who by then had already skipped town owing money to at least two other people we knew of, a contractor and a former landlord, both of whom I spoke with directly during that process, and both of whom described almost the exact same pattern of trust and disappearance. The other 9,000 I never saw again. I stopped chasing it eventually, not because I stopped caring about the money, but because I realized I was spending more energy trying to recover it than I'd spent building the entire savings account in the first place, hour for hour, across years of overtime shifts. Some losses you have to let become the cost of finding out who someone really is. I've said that to myself more times than I can count since, usually late at night, usually when the number still tries to creep back into my head uninvited. There's a particular kind of math a man does after something like this, adding up not just the dollars but the years, the overtime shifts, the vacations we skipped so the savings account could grow instead, all of it converted in his head into a single number that represents exactly how much trust actually cost him. I did that math more times than was healthy in the first year. Eventually I stopped, not because the number stopped matching, but because I realized no amount of recalculating it was going to change what had already happened. The only thing left to control was what I did with the years still in front of me. The divorce took 14 months, longer than it needed to, because she fought for the house even though I'd been the one who built half of it with my own two hands over 3 summers, laying the foundation, framing the addition, running wire through walls I'd opened myself on weekends when the kids were at their grandparents'. Those were the same hands that had signed that $18,000 check without asking a single hard question first. And there were nights during that 14 months where I sat in that unfinished addition and couldn't decide if I was proud of what I'd built or ashamed of how easily I'd almost handed it away. In the end, I kept the house. Not because the judge was generous, but because I'd kept every receipt, every text she sent Russ trying to warn him before Tom's search turned anything up, every bank record showing exactly when her name was added to that account. The same instinct that made me count 11 minutes in a laundry room is the instinct that built the case that let me keep the one thing I'd actually built with my own hands. There's a kind of justice in that, even if it came slower and cost more than it should have. Russ never faced real consequences, not in the way you'd want a man like that to face them. He moved 2 states over, started a similar company under a slightly different name, and as far as I know, he's still doing exactly what he did to us, to someone else's family right now, somewhere I'll probably never hear about until it's already too late for them. That used to eat at me more than almost anything else in this story, the idea that a man could do this and simply relocate away from it, start fresh with a new set of names and a new set of people who don't yet know what he's capable of. What I've come to understand, slower than I'd like to admit, is that men like Russ don't get caught because someone else stops them. They get caught because eventually someone stops giving them the benefit of the doubt, the way I stopped giving it the night I found that receipt. Somewhere down the line, another man is going to have his own 11 minutes in his own laundry room. I hope he trusts it faster than I did. There was a stretch, close to a year in, where I didn't trust my own judgment about anything, let alone another person. Friends tried to introduce me to women they knew, co-workers, neighbors, a cousin of a guy I'd worked with for a decade, and I turned every one of them down, not because I wasn't ready for company, but because I no longer trusted my ability to read a person clearly. I'd spent 22 years certain I understood exactly who I was married to, and I'd been wrong about the one thing that mattered most. That kind of wrong doesn't just cost you a marriage, it costs you your own confidence in your instincts, and getting that back took far longer than the divorce itself did. Our old friend group split roughly in half, the way these things tend to do, though not entirely along the lines I expected. A couple I'd have bet on siding with her sided with me instead, quietly, over a beer one night, admitting they'd known about Russ's reputation for years and had never said anything because it wasn't their place. Another couple, ones I considered close, drifted away from me entirely, and I later learned it was because my ex had gotten to them first with her own version of events, one where I came across as controlling and difficult in the aftermath. I didn't fight that narrative. I'd learned by then that some battles cost more than they're worth, and my energy was better spent on my kids and on finishing that house than on managing what other people chose to believe about a marriage they only ever saw from the outside. My ex-wife remarried within 2 years to a man I've met exactly once at our daughter's wedding, where we shook hands the way men do when they both know more about a situation than either one is willing to say out loud. I don't wish her ill. That surprised me too. How much anger can burn down to something closer to distance than hatred if you give it enough time and enough hard work. There was a period, maybe the first year, where I wanted her to lose as much as I had, and I'm not proud of some of the thoughts I had during that stretch. What I do carry now, permanently, is the lesson underneath all of it, the one I try to pass on to my son now that he's building his own life with a woman he loves. Trust isn't the absence of questions. Trust is what lets you ask the hard questions without either person treating it as an accusation. The day I stopped asking my wife hard questions, out of politeness, out of history, out of not wanting to seem like the kind of husband who doesn't trust his own wife, was the day I started losing her, long before I ever found that receipt. Tom and I grew closer through all of it, in a way I never expected out of a brother-in-law I'd previously only seen at holidays. He told me once, over a beer at his place, that he'd almost talked himself out of digging any further once he found the first thread, because some part of him hoped it would turn out to be nothing. He kept going anyway, he said, because he thought about his own daughter someday marrying a man, and he hoped that if something were ever wrong, somebody would care enough to look past the discomfort and find out for certain. That conversation has stuck with me longer than almost anything else from that entire year. It's rare that a man tells you plainly why he chose to do the hard thing instead of the easy thing, and rarer still that you get to thank him for it properly before too much time passes. I rebuilt slower than I expected to, not with another relationship right away, but with the house itself, finishing the addition I'd started years earlier and never quite completed, room by room, the way I probably should have finished paying attention to my own marriage instead of assuming it would hold itself together because it always had before. There was something almost therapeutic about it, hanging drywall alone on a Saturday, measuring twice the way my father taught me, rebuilding something with my hands while the rest of my life felt like it was still being rebuilt somewhere I couldn't see. My son moved back in for a stretch after college, and some of the best conversations of my life happened in that kitchen, the same table where I'd laid those documents down years earlier. He asked me once how I knew, really knew, that writing that check had been the wrong call, and I told him the truth. I didn't know. I felt it. And I ignored the feeling because the alternative, the conversation, the confrontation, the possibility of being wrong about my own wife, felt harder than just signing the check and hoping for the best. That's the decision that destroyed my marriage. Not the affair I never found, because there wasn't one. Not even the money. The decision to trust a feeling less than I trusted the comfort of not looking closer. If there's one thing I'd want another man my age to take from all of this, it's that the quiet decisions are the ones that matter most. Not the loud arguments, not the dramatic confrontations you see in movies. The quiet choice to ask one more question or not to. The quiet choice to check the account or trust that everything is fine because it always has been. I made the wrong quiet choice once, and it cost me $18,000 and a 22-year marriage. I made the right one, eventually, in a laundry room at 11 o'clock at night. And it's the reason I'm the man sitting here telling you this story instead of the man still standing in that kitchen, believing a story that was never true. I'd like to know if you've ever felt that same quiet warning and ignored it, or if you were braver than I was the first time it happened to you. Either way, I hope you trust it faster than I did. I think about that laundry room often, more than I probably should this many years out. Not with the same sting it used to carry, but as a kind of marker, the exact point where one version of my life ended and another one, harder one but more honest, began. 11 minutes doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud. It's shorter than this video, but it was long enough to change the direction of everything that came after it. And I've come to believe that most men get a handful of moments like that in a lifetime. Quiet, unremarkable-looking moments that are actually the hinge everything else swings on. The trick, I've learned the hard way, isn't avoiding those moments. It's recognizing one when it's standing right in front of you. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.